HIV came from SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, from chimps in southern Cameroon and crossed species when humans came into contact with infected blood. In 1959, the first known case of HIV in a human occurs in a man who died in the Congo. Later, from his preserved blood samples, confirmed as having HIV. French flight attendant Gaëtan Dugas is referred to as Patient Zero and was the first person to spread AIDS to America. The effect of AIDS makes a patient's immune system weaker, making it harder for the body to fight off infections.
In 2017, there were 36.9 million people living with AIDS, and 35.4 million people have died from AIDS since the start of the epidemic. On December 1st, 1988, the first Worldwide Health Day occurred, and since then every day has been celebrated on December 1st.
Ryan White was 13 when he contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. Living in Kokomo, Indiana, his school told him he couldn't go to school even though it was known at the time that AIDS couldn't be contracted by casual contact. White took his case to court and was told that he could go to school under certain requirements, like being in a separate restroom, no gym, separate water fountains, etc. His community responded very badly. 20 students dropped out and started their own school. White was bullied and lies were spread, like he bited people, he spit on his food, restaurants threw away dishes, and there was a lot of vandalism on his locker and anti-gay slurs, even though White was not gay. White's story was publicized, and he received lots of supporting media attention. A movie was made about Ryan, and he later moved to Cicero, Indiana. His community welcomed the White family, and Ryan had a supportive school. White and his mother, Jean, are known as two of the world's best-known AIDS activists and educators. Jean White founded the Ryan White Foundation, which is education for young people, and in 1990, a few months after Ryan White's death at age 18, Congress passed the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Care, called the CARE Act, which this aims to improve quality of care for low-income families with AIDS who have no insurance.
In 1986, John Graziano was a boy who was diagnosed with AIDS. He contracted the virus from his biological mother, and he was later adopted. AIDS prevented him from going to school in Indianapolis, so the family moved to Wilmette, where he was welcomed into a local school. The principal of the school saw no reason that he shouldn't be treated like everyone else. Graziano loved school. It made him feel normal, and the rest of the students were extremely supportive too. He died on May 13th at 19 years old, and the funeral was held on his birthday.
At this time, many people weren't sure what AIDS was. They were scared that the virus was highly contagious and could be contracted by holding hands or catch the disease from a public toilet seat. Because people thought this disease was very contagious, many people were discriminated. For example, the gay men were a big factor of discrimination.
Prior to 1982, people referred to the disease as the gay-related immune deficiency, aka GRID. Then in 1982, the Centers for Disease Control named the disease AIDS, as it can not only be transmitted through gay people, but also through sharing needles, unprotected sex, breast milk, etc. On top of having to deal with the disease, gay people also had to deal with the discrimination against them by the public.
Some examples of gay discrimination were people called it the gay plague. They also used anti-gay slurs and viewed them differently.
When Ronald Reagan was president, the AIDS crisis was at its peak, and yet Reagan didn't address the issue at all. He didn't even use the word AIDS until his last year in office. Reagan's administration talked about it during interviews in a joking way, calling it the gay plague. The Reagan administration was eager to cut the size of the federal budget and reluctant to address the needs of homosexuals. They repeatedly resisted taking the lead against the epidemic.
Even one of the most concerned federal officials, Edward M. Brandt Jr., an assistant secretary in the Department of Health and Human Services, told Congress in 1983 that emergency spending was unnecessary, just 4 days before he wrote an internal memorandum warning that important AIDS work cannot be undertaken because of the lack of available resources.
Magic Johnson was a professional basketball player for the LA Lakers. In November of 1991, Johnson announced that he has HIV and was retiring and was going to focus on educating young people on HIV and AIDS. People began to realize that anyone can contract HIV, not just gay white men. Within a few months of Johnson's announcement, the number of people seeking HIV tests in New York City rose by 60%. Magic Johnson was put on the National Commission on AIDS by President George Bush in 1992. However, Johnson soon realized the commission did nothing and he resigned, writing a letter to the president that he had dropped the ball. In 2008, Johnson worked and supported the gay rights movement, attempting to defeat Proposition 8 in California, saying at the time that the same-sex marriage ban was unfair and wrong.
Arthur Ashe was an African-American tennis player during the 1970s. In the early 1980s, Arthur Ashe contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion during surgery. He kept this information secret until being asked about addressing rumors about him having the disease. After being asked about it, Ashe said, "I am angry that I was put in a position of having to lie if I wanted to protect my privacy." Ashe had known he had AIDS 3 years before publicly announcing it during this interview, but chose not to say anything because he was worried about being criticized and not being seen the same if people saw him as an AIDS patient instead of an athlete. The public's response to this was very odd, as the general view of AIDS was very negative, but at the same time, hearing this type of announcement from a famous athlete was depressing and surprising. The public found it strange hearing from a straight, married, well-educated father confess about having AIDS during this time period. Sadly, Arthur Ashe died at the age of 49 on February 6, 1993, but did a lot to fight for the acceptance of AIDS patients after retiring.
One activist against gay discrimination was a pop and graffiti artist, Keith Haring, in the 80s in New York. He gained popularity from his graffiti in the subways and painted on blank advertising pages. He contracted AIDS and fought to promote AIDS awareness through his art by promoting the end of drug usage, promoted safe sex, and brought awareness to AIDS. His art evolved into a cultural history in the 80s and ended up drawing on the Berlin Wall.
Another activist against gay discrimination was Larry Kramer, as he first began speaking about AIDS by criticizing people with AIDS and other gay people like most of the public did. Being a writer, he wrote novels criticizing gay people for having AIDS and saying their behaviors are unacceptable in society. He then became motivated to help AIDS causes after seeing so many people being affected by the disease, including people very close to him. Kramer became the co-founder of GMHC, Gay Men's Health Clinic, to help HIV-infected patients in New York. After a few years of working for GMHC, Larry Kramer decided that he wasn't doing enough to contribute to AIDS, so he founded ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, in 1987. This organization increased the public understanding of AIDS, pressed FDA to release new treatment and make new medications more affordable, demanded national policy on AIDS, prohibited discrimination towards AIDS patients, and did much more to help AIDS patients.
On Sunday, December 12, 1989, over 5,000 members of ACT UP protested at St. Patrick's Cathedral. They stood outside disrupting the Mass and protesting against the Archdiocese because they prevented education on AIDS.
AIDS Memorial Quilt is a memorial to celebrate the lives of people who have died of AIDS-related causes. The AIDS Memorial Quilt is warehoused in Atlanta, Georgia, and it will continue to grow. It currently consists of 4,800 individual memorial panels. You are able to go to their website, and it will tell you how to make a panel to add it to the quilt. Its goal was to bring awareness to AIDS. It also wanted to raise funds for community-based AIDS services